present what we.
Okay. So this is the final ecology project. This is the title. It's leaf herbology and fungal occurrences on trees. Um, so basically, what we do in this project is we break down the effects of fungus and organisms on local trees we found around campus. We had a couple research questions, not necessarily a hypothesis, because we were studying more about trees and effects on the trees rather than trying to hypothesize a question and prove a point. So the first one was, what was the impact of fungus on tree leaves? So we break down fungal deterioration on like a bunch of different leaves on different trees. We had a total of 8 different trees that we investigated their leaves. Um, how do insects affect the tree leaves? So we use our observational skills to kind of detect what kind of different kinds of effects that insects were having. Some examples of the kinds of damage was like chewing and mining. So chewing is pretty self-explanatory. Insects were taking bites out of the leaves, and then mining is like kind of drilling through the leaf and leaving small holes in it. Those were just two of the ones we saw the most. How different tree species respond to different fungi and animals. So different leaves had different were affected differently by different kinds of fungus and the same kinds of fungus, and they always didn't correspond the same. So we compared and contrasted um, the results of those on the different leaves, and how are we able to observe the damages. So we used a few different methods to collect data and observe what kind of damage was done, how it was done, and we used that to record and figure out what's going on.
All right, the methods that we used were so our goal was to try to get the percent of damage done on the trees, like Sean said, through like the fungal damage or other bugs that are around. And so what we did is that e we each did 2 trees, so 8 trees, and then from those 8 trees we took 10 leaves and we used a grid to measure the surface area of. First we needed to find how like the surface area of the leaf in general, and then we found the surface area of the damage done to the leaf, and we put that together and found the percent of damage done. And to present that, we put it in a bar graph for each tree. Yeah, that's our grid method from my 2 trees and then from Sean's 2 trees. And then we put all that information into a graph where we would get the overall surface area and all that. Yeah.
So looking at our results, we have this graph here, which shows the average overall leaf surface area and then compared to the average percent leaf damage. So our main observation was between how big a leaf is and how much damage we see. Not focusing specifically really on the herbivore or fungal da type damage, but more as like an overall observation. What is the correlation between the size of these leaves and the percent damage that occurred. So, looking at the graph, we can see that there's a pretty proportional positive relationship overall. The more surface area that the uh, trees' leaves had, the more damage usually was occurring. The graph is a good representation of that. However, it's tough to say if that was necessarily because the tree leaves were bigger or some other factors. So moving forward, it would be more like you'd have to run further experiments on certain aspects of these trees besides looking at like leaf size and other stuff in order to really grasp what's going on here. But Yeah, there's like one or two outliers as well, such as Tree 2 for Ethan had a very high average percent leaf damage, one of our highest, but overall leaf surface area was a lot smaller. So we could see that as being kind of a problem in the theory that we have here. But overall, the correlation is strong.
Yeah, so common trend we saw, as Heath explained, was that the larger the leaf, the more damage you usually saw. While that necessarily wasn't the case all around, it was the overall, um, it was the outlier in the data. Um, and again, we didn't focus entirely on which kind of damage occurred more. It's mostly just overall damage compared to the leaves. Um, One of the things that we couldn't determine though was whether the cause of this damage was the leaf types or locations or size of the trees. So we couldn't rule out that these were outliers just because of location or the type of herbivores around.
Yeah, and I think another interesting observation we made is that when looking and assessing our locations that we used, most were kind of on campus or near campus in more of an urban kind of setting. So we didn't see a whole bunch of, deterioration, whether it was fungal or insect based, or, there wasn't much, wildlife or whatever you would call it affecting the plants. It was pretty much under 27%. Like the mean value on it was like 20% damage no matter what size, like comparing all leaves. So we kind of assessed that, the urban atmosphere was much more safe for trees and their leaves, not a whole bunch of insects and, you know um, fungus around to affect it. And we used a couple different academic journals that we found through the NC State database. The one on the left was a journal on herbology, and we just kind of used it as a baseline to figure out what we were dealing with, and how we could assess these different tree species, and uncover what kind of trees they are, and how they're affected by fungus and wildlife. um, the one on the right was very similar. It was talking about insects and herbology. Um, yeah, and so we used that as also another baseline to just kind of get a feel of what we were working with. And yeah, that's really bad at. Yeah, I think we're good. Are you still recording?
Yeah, it's still recording. How much time did we get?
I think we're good.